Welcome to the Still Life Podcast, a series of 21 topics, with each episode exploring the practical nature of the spiritual experience. With time-tested insights from psychotherapy, evolutionary biology, and meditation, from ex-animator and stillness coach, Jim.
Because I view Jim George as a trainer for the soul. There's no better animation artist, drawer than Jim.
He is a friend, he is a mentor, incredible advisor. There's no one who's more important to me in my life.
The most interesting, most intelligent person I've ever met.
He truly is somebody who wants nothing from you and everything for you.
My name is Henry, and I'm a former client of Jim's, and the work we've done together over the past 8 years has changed my life. We're now on a mission to share these insights with you, and to draw some pretty interesting conclusions on how to live a still life. Well, good morning, Jim.
Hello, Henry.
How you doing?
I'm always better for having seen you.
Oh, stop it.
I'm the luckiest guy on earth.
Yeah,
I'm serious. These conversations are very important, at least to me. I hope they are to everybody else. Because it's one thing to have a general, vague idea about something. It's another thing to climb in deep, to get more and more understanding. That's where the wisdom comes. So I appreciate this. Just the fact that you're here is a big deal.
Yeah, I find a lot of the time with understanding comes release, where there's sort of a freedom that is reflexive in terms of if you really truly get something, it can set you free from what it is that it is doing to you. I mean, I think a good example of this is any type of conflict I've had with somebody else. When I use a lot of the things that we've been discussing in terms of focus, changing the scope of context, and then sort of superimposing all of these different ideas on top of it, I often find that there's a relief from my suffering, where it's like, of course they're acting in that way.
Yes.
Right?
How could they not?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's
beautiful.
also great to be like, wow, I'm having a very subjective experience, and as are they, and they're the center of their own universe with their own reality.
Yes.
And it's beautiful. So usually we save this to the end, but thank you for diving in so deeply, because I know it's not easy to really try and wrap your arms around a couple of these topics, because
there's nothing there to wrap.
and some of them are massive. It's like you don't even have arms that can get even close to it.
You don't ask the easy questions, and I love you for that. I really do.
Of course. You love me, but I'm sure there's a part of you that's maybe not so loving in terms of like, my God, what has he got me into? Because especially today, we've got a pretty scary topic, don't we, Mr. George?
Scary indeed.
Yeah. We are talking about fear.
Yeah.
And so, as per usual, could you please help to just go over the essence of what fear really is?
See, again, this is why I love you, because for the first time, you didn't ask me to define it. You want to go below what a word means. You asked for the essence of the thing, and I want to thank you for that, because we can climb into the etymology of this word. It's interesting, but who cares? We get to the essence of the thing. We're going to relieve some of this suffering that you're talking about. So, first, I'd like to suggest that fear is an emotion. Now, we can get into what emotions are, why, how they work, if you like. We do that a little bit later, but I'm going to do my best to keep this lean and as simple as possible. So, it's an emotion. An emotion is something we feel. We don't think an emotion, we feel an emotion. It's a state of awareness predominated by feeling. Okay? So what is it that we feel? What is it and how do we feel it? I'd like to suggest, remember this is just my take on stuff, that at its simplest level, okay, any emotion, but in this case fear, any emotion, the first most basic thing you're feeling is what's called valence. And we talked briefly about valence in our meaning podcast. This inclination to, toward, or away from something. In this case, fear is a profoundly negatively valenced emotion. We're experiencing a relative, it depends on how intense, we're experiencing a relative aversive response to anything that is perceived consciously, unconsciously, directly or indirectly as a threat to our survival. You see how important this is, and that it is negatively valenced. That's crucial. We want that. Even though negatively valenced is unpleasant rather than pleasant, it's undesirable rather than desirable, crucial. So we're perceiving that. Then at the next level of complexity, up from that, how much? We're perceiving salience. And remember, we talked about salience as well, the range of intensity of that negatively valenced emotion. Okay? From mild irritation, a little anxiety, all the way up to sheer full-blown terror and everything in between. Okay? So this aversive response to anything that we perceive, directly, indirectly, consciously, unconsciously, as a threat to our survival. But fear is crucial because it's so intensely connected to our survival. Okay? Unlike a lot of the other emotions, that's pretty much what it's there for. It's an aspect of our limbic system. And that limbic system is that subsystem within the greater nervous system tasked with our survival, keeping us alive. So that limbic system has to be the fastest and most intense, most urgent system in the body. It has to be, because survival can be a matter of milliseconds. And it can't afford to wait around for us to take all the time that it takes to have our conscious, rational thoughts about things. It's got to kick in right away. And that's exactly what it's evolved to do. Okay? So what is that urge? That's so urgent? Again, anytime we perceive something, consciously or unconsciously, okay, directly or indirectly, that is perceived as a threat to our survival, fear kicks in. That negative valence and a range of intensity, that salience kicks in. Okay? How does it do that? I think it's important to know, because it isn't just random. This system of ours, this limbic system, uses incredibly powerful chemicals, neurochemicals called stress hormones. And we hear this term, but it's important to really get what that means. These are very, very powerful neurochemicals, so powerful they make pure China white heroin look like ketchup. And the key to this thing is they have evolved over millennia to transform us from our normal happy-go-lucky selves to, if necessary, completely insane maniacs who are capable at superhuman levels to either fight or run for our lives. And that transformation can take place in seconds. You get what a powerful thing that is. And because this limbic system is overriding any other system, including our conscious, deliberative minds, one of the things it does when it has to is it shuts that down. That's unnecessary. We're trying to survive now. That takes too much time and too much energy. Okay? So this incredibly powerful, negatively valenced emotion that we feel through a range of salience from mild anxiety all the way up to sheer terror, chemically induced so that we survive. It's an incredible thing. It's a great thing. It is a natural and necessary thing. We want it, even though we don't like it. So does that kind of put a fence around this thing? Because it's a big topic.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what's quite brilliant about the way that you outlined it is you sort of answered my follow-up question in terms of like evolutionarily, why did this sort of become necessary? And what I got from what you were saying is that having a very strong, salient, reflexive response to an environmental cue that could be putting our life at risk is absolutely necessary in order to maximize our likelihood for survival in an environment that we've since left. However, we still have all of these very powerful mechanisms within ourselves.
That's right.
So that when something happens that threatens either our actual physical life, but as we've spoken about in past podcasts, the story that we're telling ourselves now, our psychological lives, that helps to secure status and helps to secure our survival. If something threatens that, having a knee-jerk, very quick, very powerful response is incredibly helpful. And even though it doesn't feel very good, it's good that it doesn't.
It's necessary.
Because it's propelling us towards an action to relieve that feeling.
Brilliant. Yes.
So I think that, well, that's really great. Thank you, Jim.
Well, sure. But that's only part of the evolutionary story. See, that's the part that we're so used to this that it's hiding in plain sight. We often don't appreciate it for what it is. We can't imagine not having that. In fact, part of making sure that fear is healthy and not unhealthy is an increased appreciation and understanding of what it is, how to recognize it, so that we begin to see we're living with so much unconscious fear. And the question is that continuing to be healthy or not? That's where the evolutionary piece comes in, and why I'm so glad you ask about that. People may kind of gloss over that, but it's important.
Well, do you have more to add then?
Well, in a nutshell, I'd like to suggest, remember, this is just me, our evolving perception of the world, and it is constantly evolving, right, has elaborated into what's known as emergent complexity. As this ability to perceive, we're creating new and elaborated sensory systems, sense organs. They continue to get more and more complex as they evolve. That's this emergent quality that just happens. But that's constrained by what I like to think of as an energy budget imposed on us living creatures by nature. We talked a little bit about the energy budget in our habit podcast. So this energy budget is very simple and it's non-negotiable. We can only use as much energy as we take in and or store in our bodies. Okay? We're not like the federal government. We can't just keep spending and go into deficit. If we use more energy than we take in or can store, we die. That's an ultimatum, non-negotiable. So this evolutionary process is a step-by-step process with checks and balances to make sure that energy budget stays in place. So imagine our ability to perceive anything. It's very difficult to imagine being an organism that doesn't perceive anything out there. But try. We're a simple proto-creature. We're multicellular creature. We're going along. We are only using as much energy as we take in. And then there's a weird mutation, a variation. Suddenly, one of these creatures develops the ability to perceive disturbances, perturbations in the electromagnetic field, in a specific frequency of that field that we humans call light. Okay? This creature has that capacity. Mother Nature, and I just do this because I spent too much time in animation, so I'm picturing these things. Mother Nature calls time out on the game, calls the referee over, which is evolution, and says, give me a ruling on this. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Evolution says, well, the thing survived long enough to pass its genes, so it can't be a bad thing or it would have died. But we don't know if it's giving it an advantage for survival yet. Doesn't matter. Nature says, great, let the games resume. And eons pass. Another weird variation, a mutation. Okay? Now this creature can not only perceive the presence of light. That's a binary system. It's either light or dark. The 2-bit system. It's so simple we can't even conceive of it. Now, another creature has the ability to perceive a range of light and dark, from black to white, all the way through gray, different increments of light and dark. Nature calls time out, calls it's the whole thing. Thing has survived, so it must not be a bad thing. We're not sure if it's giving an advantage yet, but it hasn't quite used up more energy than it's taking in, so yeah, it can keep playing the game. Great, let the games continue. This continues. The next thing, an ability to perceive different frequencies of that light, to detect differences and note differences between frequencies, what we now call color, and almost can't imagine not having color. Okay? Woof. Wow. Same process. Ref, what's the deal? It's alive, it's lived long enough to pass its genes, must be okay. The problem is, it's just detecting data. Data. Okay, but what do you do with this data? So eons pass. Here's where the emotion part comes in. I like to suggest that there's a variant, a mutation, and this mutation is the ability to sense valence, simple binary valence. This is a good thing. I like this thing. This is a bad thing. I don't like this thing. Okay? I'm suggesting that capacity, and preferably not on the same sensory channel as the visual, but a different sense, in this case, a feeling sense that works in conjunction with that, allows for the very beginnings of meaning. What does it mean when these berries are red? When I eat these red berries, I get more energy. When I eat these sort of gray, green, brown berries, I get sick. I experience valence now, and I'm beginning to have the rudiments of meaning, all based on my survival. What does it mean that something's red? What does it mean when something's gray-green? And it starts with our survival. This is the birth of emotions. This is the birth of our preferences. And we learn these things over the course of our lives. And so you can kind of get this evolutionary thing. I'd like to suggest that fear is our primary negative emotion, primary negatively valenced emotion. I'd like to suggest that all other negatively valenced emotions are derivative of fear. Even more, I'd like to suggest that there's an element of fear in every one of those negatively valenced emotions. And conversely, though we'll get into this some other time, I'd like to suggest that the primary positive emotion, positively valenced emotion, is what I call capital L love. A profound feeling, a sense of wholeness, completeness, connection, well-being. And that all of our positively valenced emotions are derivative of that through evolution. So you see how this evolution piece comes in. It's almost impossible to imagine perceiving color but having no meaning attached to it. It's what I call the Spock effect. People always talk, remember Spock from Star Trek?
No, but I know of him in terms of an emotionless kind of
theoretically, he's this creature that doesn't have emotion. He's not cluttered with emotion. He's not bothered with emotion. And in the mind of Gene Roddenberry, who's putting this thing together, that must seem like an interesting and useful thing. I'd like to suggest that if that were true, Spock would be unable to make any decisions. He'd be paralyzed and probably die before he passed his genes. I'm suggesting that prior to any decision is a perception of valence, even if it's an unconscious perception of valence. And that even the most pointy-headed physics geek looks at a board full of equations, and it is the perception of valence that makes him or her go, yeah, that's it. Even if they're not consciously aware that they have any emotions at all, there's a perception that says, that's it, or not yet.
And this actually is kind of reinforced by modern day neuroscience, because there's a man over at USC by the name of Antonio Damasio.
Oh, legend.
Who wrote Descartes' Error, and he talks about emotion in decision making and really uses a couple of case studies of people that have had lesions.
Yes.
So damage or
yes.
actual straight, just sort of, when I say damage, one of the people that he uses as an example is a guy called Phineas Gage, who was a rail worker and had a
spike goes right into his head.
It went up through and just basically took out a chunk of his
Wiped
brain.
it out.
Yeah, and what was crazy is that he was still functional, but he didn't have the emotional capacity anymore.
Yes.
This was a part of the prefrontal cortex that basically helped to integrate the meaning aspect to decision making, and the guy couldn't connect with people and couldn't make like good rational decisions.
Yes.
And that it goes right to your point in terms of how important it is to have these emotions interwoven into our decision making, just in general. And this, I mean, we can go right back to bloody Plato and Timaeus, talking about like, what is it that is actually driving us as humans? Is it emotion, or is it rational thoughts?
Yes.
And it goes back and forth, but really it is a weaving of the two, and it's pretty damn context dependent. But if we go back to what you were saying earlier, there's so much of this that is layered in our subconscious because it needs to work at such a quick pace in very sort of pressing contexts.
Yes.
And you also mentioned how it's important to understand healthy and unhealthy fear.
Yeah.
So what I was getting from that is that being able to actually analyze the feelings that we are feeling with our conscious mind and deliberate whether it's healthy or unhealthy,
Yes.
and then get underneath, understand what it is that's actually going on within us, can help to relieve and at least remap some of that reflexive feeling, so that we don't necessarily fall into the same patterns and same traps.
Exactly right.
Okay, good. I'm glad that we're on the same page here.
And you're bringing up Plato and Timaeus. Why, for the love of the gods, is it vital that it's either emotion or rational thought? Why does it have to be one or the other, guys? You're philosophers. Why does it have to be one or the other? It's both. And it's the magic of being able to shuttle back and forth between those two things, not have one dominate. Use them both, and it's greater than the sum of the parts. I hope that's something that people can get more of, that way excessively emotional people can get the benefit of a little rational thought, but excessively rational and removed people who have no emotion in their lives, mostly because they're afraid of what happens when you have emotion, can learn that some emotion is really useful. It's really helpful. It's not one or the other.
And well, the distinction itself to me seems like a misplaced bucketing.
Good.
Because it seems as if that's actually pretty symptomatic of the conscious mind trying to make neat little rules for
and
things.
I'm the boss.
Yeah. And be like, well, there's rational thought and then there's emotion, and those two things are different. But if we really think about them, you're talking about a spectrum, and it's a blend, and a lot of it is contextual in the first place. And who are we to say, like, when I'm actually experiencing something, our conversation right now is colored both by thought and emotion, right? And depending on somebody walking in the room with an axe and saying, like, hey, bye-bye, that changes the balance of such.
Yes.
And hence the salience of the emotion that I'm feeling as a reaction to what's going on.
Yes.
But I do want to just zoom in on what you were talking about in terms of if somebody is hyper rational and they don't want to feel an emotion, that could actually be fear as a response.
Good for you.
Can you?
Why don't they? Why don't they want to feel an emotion? Explore that, because what you're feeling, cowboy, is an emotion. A profound aversive response to something that you, consciously or unconsciously, directly or indirectly, are perceiving as a threat to your survival.
The stereotype that comes to mind right away is sort of the masculine type of, well, just, growing up in England, it's stiff upper lip, right? There's this, and that to me as an expression is repress your emotion and continue on with what we're doing. And it gets to a point where it's like, even just bringing up that there is something that might be there is absolutely like, don't go there. It's really tender topic.
Yeah, stiff is the operative word.
Yes.
Yeah.
So why is it the case that, let's use the example of that you were just using, hyper-rational person who is constantly in their thoughts and has learned maybe throughout their life that engaging with or expressing and trying to discuss a negative emotion is not something that's done. I'm thinking of, 1950s post-war, you're not going there. We're not talking about that.
Right. Why?
I was going to ask you why.
Well, think about it. You said it, post-war, a situation that we have to recognize is not a normal state to be in. It's a high-stakes game of survival. At that point, okay, other than the emotion of fear and the question, what happens if my fear gets the better of me? Anybody who's been in war says you're terrified the whole time. It's chaos. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's going on in spite of it. And so, as a kind of protective device, a lot of soldiers just cordon off any kind of emotional response because it would overwhelm them. That's what PTSD is all about. There's too much stuff that's happening. I can't integrate this. It's coming too quickly. Half my unit just got killed. My best friend's face just got blown off right in front of me, and they're still coming. I can't stop and mourn the loss of the... I got to get at it. So we repress that only to have it haunt us for the rest of our lives. That is a healthy response in an unhealthy environment. It's as good as we can do. That doesn't mean it's optimal, and it doesn't mean that a lot of unhealthy fear arises out of it, though. I'm really glad you brought that up, because it's fear of what will happen to me if I let my emotions come up, including fear.
So you brought up PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Yeah. So that, in its definition, has the word trauma in it.
Yes.
So trauma, to me, seems as if it's a extraordinarily salient event.
You bet, by definition.
It's sort of like a branding of this is a really threatening event to me.
Yes.
And therefore, whatever reaction was used in that situation is one that is like, you survived. Mm-hmm. Like, let's not think about anything. It worked, right? It worked. So that is like deep in the brainstem.
Yes.
That is there, right? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to trauma, it seems as if there's, let's make a distinction. Dr. Gabor Mate makes one of these, and he's a great guy when it comes to talking about trauma.
Sure.
But like big T trauma and little t trauma, right?
It's highly relative, though, to the individual. I'm saying the responses can be very similar. And one person's trauma is another person's skin knee. But that doesn't mean that you're not having a traumatic response to it. It's just, relatively speaking, I stubbed my toe is very different than someone just almost killed me.
Speaking of trauma.
Trauma. They're on their way to one right now.
Yeah. So the traumatic response can be, it's relative to the person. And I think when training for war, it's like, let's condition the person to not necessarily have all of the hardwired responses, or some of them, in terms of freeze. It's like, how can we basically create artificial situations where the person can overcome that, so that when they're in a life or death situation, they have far better responses to being able to weave through that elegantly.
Exactly.
With the little t trauma that we're all experiencing, you know, you can go all the way back to birth trauma. Mm-hmm. You know, let's not go there, because I really am not qualified to talk about. Really not qualified to talk about birth trauma. But we all sort of have some of these traumas, and that has a fear response to it, and then that expresses itself throughout our days, our weeks, whatever that may be. And you mentioned that fear is kind of this primary emotion that is felt. and all of the other emotions are sort of pop out of that. So
Derive from it.
they
Yeah,
derive
yeah.
from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so throughout my day, for example, if I get triggered by something,
Yes.
it could be a fear response, and then with my reaction, that emotional state could be a pattern, a habit that I have learned to sort of put on, a costume that I've put on to deal with that certain contextual situation
Yeah.
in order to get myself through it.
Yeah.
So I think my question here is, when it comes to trauma, that's such a sort of hot word these days. Everybody's trying to experience what it's like to heal their traumas and
Sure.
their wounds, etc., etc.
Sure.
Is trauma just a psychic wound? And how do you think about your own sort of fear responses to trauma in general? Because I feel as if everybody's got some of that they're carrying around with them.
I hope. Because if they don't have something like that, I'd say they're in very grave danger because they have no emotional inoculation against anything that's going to happen to them. Remember what an inoculation is, what a vaccine is. Active or inactive, doesn't matter, I'm speaking generally. You give a little bit of the thing you're fighting to your body and let it do what it does. Get used to it, build up antibodies. Emotionally, it's kind of the same thing. But I'd like to suggest that the key to these fears, these different kinds of fears, usually associated with one degree or another, okay, we'll say minor, capital T, small t, trauma, okay, is association. Association is the key to all of these things. I would like to suggest that fear is the anticipation of something negative based upon associations. And our minds, our brains, are wired to make associations, especially when it counts. We're constantly perceiving patterns, perceiving correlations, perceiving relationships between things, creatures, circumstances, even when those patterns don't exist. Those correlations don't exist. I mean, for millennia, human beings been looking up at the night sky and seeing 4 points of light and saying, look, it's a bear, it's a bull, it's a scorpion. Some Martian would come down and go, what the hell are you talking about? It's 4 dots. How do you... It's a pattern. It's a pattern. And it means something. It has salience. Because that's the advantage. That's the survival advantage. So we're inclined to do that, sometimes to a fault. But it tends to work. So let's talk about a classical, clinical fear. And we have to be careful when we're talking about fears, phobias, that we're distinguishing. Are we talking about clinical fear, clinical phobia, or we're just using that word? Because there's a clear distinction between a clinical fear and a clinical phobia. They're very different, but they're sort of used interchangeably.
So when you say clinical to a degree, even then, that seems as if when we talk about something being clinical, it's because a thought system has been sort of built so deeply that requires such a fine specificity in order to communicate and be able to absolutely be on the same page as somebody else.
Yes.
So when we're going into the discrepancy between fear and phobia, yeah, absolutely. If you have the sort of clinical definitions in terms of how they are different, please go right ahead.
Because I've had to do a lot of work in the past with people with fears and phobias. So a fear, first of all, we're talking clinically. So the question is this an a healthy or an unhealthy fear. It doesn't become the subject of a clinical practice unless and until you're trying to help somebody with something that is kind of, by definition, becoming pathological. It's starting to interfere with somebody's life. So that's how I distinguish between healthy and unhealthy fear. If it's helping you survive, keeping you healthy, allowing you to continue to live and thrive, even reduce some of your suffering, healthy, keep it. If it's starting to get in the way of your life, starting to impede your ability to live effectively, and is starting to cause more and more suffering, let's call that pathological or unhealthy. So we're talking clinically now about the difference between fear, an unhealthy fear, and a phobia. A fear is something someone is afraid of, and there is a known cause, or etiology as they refer to it. So I'm 2-3 years old. I'm playing with the neighbor's dog. And in my childish ignorance, playing with the neighbor's dog means poking my fingers in its eyes. It growls and it bites me. To your point, I'm now traumatized. I'm completely overloaded. I am experiencing profound negative valence. I'm experiencing physical pain, intense. And there is this fear response associated at an autonomic level with that pain. Let's come back to that. Okay? That, as you said, is branded. It's seared into my neurology because my survival depends on it. Boom! That is now burned into my neurology. It's in my body. It's what the yogic tradition refers to as a samskara. What is burned in is my little 2 to 3 year old snapshot of what just happened. That's everything I consciously or unconsciously think is important about this situation. Because Venus is busy being in retrograde, but I didn't notice it. I notice a bunch of stuff around this. Okay? From that point, I am afraid of this thing called a dog, and I generalize that. Now I'm afraid of dogs, period. And that's great. It's kept me safe, kept me from being eaten alive by that dog. I never play with that dog next door ever again. 10 years later, I'm walking down the sidewalk. Somebody's coming the other way with one of those monsters on the end of a little string with a handle on it. I don't know why, but I just got to get away from that thing. And then I remember, I do what's called revivication. I have regressed back to age 2 to 3. I'm having the same response. Because anything that's like that, I have a negative valenced response to it. Does that make sense? Anything like that, original experience, well, that's one of those creatures, stay away from it. So I'm on the other side of the sidewalk. If possible, I cross the street. I stop going to places where those monstrous creatures are. Okay? That may or may not begin to interfere with my life. And if I'm really sharp, I may notice other people don't have that fear. So it must not be universal. These people are walking with these creatures. They're not biting them. But I may not, because remember, I've regressed to age 2 to 3. All that matters in terms of survival is stay away from those things. Okay? So far, so good, but 10 years later, I meet the girl of my dreams. I love her. She is so smart. She is so sweet. She's beautiful. And she feels the same way about me. We've decided, this may be the one. Except for this minor little problem. She has an adorable golden retriever puppy named Elmo. I'm terrified of that thing. But other things have come into my life, other fears, so I can't tell her. But I still have that fear. 3 months of dating her, and she finally says, why do we always go back to your place instead of my place after a date? I keep making stuff up, and then finally I've got to cop to her. I'm afraid of your dog. And she looks at me, cocks her head, and says, you're afraid of Elmo? He's adorable. Everybody loves Elmo. I'm terrified. I think he's going to bite me. He doesn't bite. He'll lick you to death before he bites you. Now it's really interfering with my life. I've got to do something about that. Because if I'm not careful, it's going to cost me the relationship of my life. That's an unhealthy fear. And I have to work with people who've had those kinds of experiences. It's a challenge, but the challenge of working with a phobia, which is a fear without a known cause or etiology. It's like hunting in the dark. Because of that association, the associative nature of our minds, you can suddenly become aware of the fact that you are feeling anxious driving under a freeway overpass. I have no idea why, but I just don't like driving under overpasses. And if you ask yourself why, your brain may confabulate a story. Well, if there's an earthquake, it would be a terrible place to be, so don't ever drive under one. Okay. Pretty soon, you're being late to work because you're afraid to drive under freeway overpasses. You're creating these weird routes through LA, avoiding freeway. What you don't know is that years ago, one time driving home from work, without remembering, you missed lunch. Your blood sugar tanked. It went through the floor. Your body on that energy budget went into storage and brought up energy in the form of glycogen from your muscles, from your liver, and it did that with those stress hormones. Cortisol, epinephrine, sometimes called adrenaline because it's made by your adrenal glands, how that epinephrine changes and becomes norepinephrine, so it does the same thing in your brain. Catecholamine, all of these things kick in, and you get more energy, but you also get this fight-flight response. You're shaking. You're anxious. You're hypervigilant. And in that hypervigilance, you look up and realize you're driving under a freeway overpass, and you make that association at an unconscious level. You're not aware of it. And that phobia continues to grow and grow and grow. The association is there, but you haven't been able to recognize it. Then you develop what's called anticipatory anxiety. You're anticipating feeling anxious when you drive under these freeway overpasses. Now just the thought of doing it is making you anxious until finally it's really interfering with your life. That's a negative form of fear. It got there through association. We can weed it out through the same path, but it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a will to do it. I don't mean to wander off, but these are the kinds of things that are important to understand about how this works. That limbic system is the fastest, most powerful system in your body, most urgent. It doesn't care whether you're happy about it. It doesn't care if you're fulfilled or not. It's only trying to keep you alive. Fear is its biggest club, its biggest tool. You get afraid enough, you're going to avoid stuff that you should avoid when it's healthy.
Okay, I've got a lot here. So, and I'm throwing my pen across the room.
Well, that's a good non-fear.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I just wanted to really punctuate that point, eh? So our minds have an ability to, it's really symbolism, right? We have an ability to see things around us, not just see, but smell and hear, using our primary senses to understand what's going on around us and to create associations. Now, there are some of these associations that can be stored in a way that makes it so there's a larger fear response to whatever that thing is. Now, you mentioned age is a primary contributor there, because if we just think about, if I have fewer emotions and then one very salient stimulus, if I have fewer experiences and one very salient stimulus, it's like if I have one vicious dog and that's the only vicious dog in my life, then it's going to be easier to create a broad stroke rule where it's like dogs equal bad. Let's get scared. Right? However, if I was raised with dogs all the way up till I'm 17 years old and I have all of these experiences with friendly animals, and then I have one angry dog, it's actually the exception rather than the rule itself.
Perfect. So all dogs aren't bad.
Exactly. So the rules itself, that's one way in which our mind works to create a very sort of reflexive and strong fear response. But another one can just be the salience of whatever it may be. For example, if I'm driving under the underpass and I get really hungry really quickly, and it's sort of like a very salient, unfamiliar experience to me, it's like a strong pairing that might have been created unconsciously. I wasn't aware of that pairing having occurred, and my mind having this sort of broad stroke useful ability might actually make a faulty association where it's like, that's not really contextually correct. Because,
but be careful. I don't want to cut you off, but be careful. I'm not talking about hunger. I'm talking about anxiety. See, that's the thing to remember. I hate to cut you off, but it's vital. Because if somebody thinks, well, I'm just hungry, okay, I'm anxious. Because in order to compensate for that low blood sugar, my body went to those stress hormones. It created a minor fight-flight situation in my body. There's no extrinsic reason for that. I'm anxious. My hands are shaking. I'm feeling anxiety, and I don't know why. I'm driving under an overpass, and that's the connection that gets made, okay? I'm sorry, but that's really important. Anxiety, not just hunger, okay? So keep going. This is great.
And so really that anxiety itself is a state of mind that can be picked up on by others. And so I think where my mind went when we were talking earlier was that it's so brilliant to be able to actually step away from what it is that you're feeling and look back into it and sort of analyze what is really going on and start to surface a lot of these unconscious patterns because they're resulting in states of mind that might be misfit or mismatched to the situation.
Good for you.
And then being able to say, okay, here's stimulus, here's response. That stimulus actually doesn't warrant that response. And really digging into that is becoming sort of more, it's increasing the granularity of basically understanding your emotions and understanding why they might be there and why they might be constructed to that degree. And so if somebody says like, no, we don't talk about the war because it's just like, I don't want any of that. It's so aversive. Let's not go into it. There's no sort of gentle exposure and examination because there isn't sort of the safe environment that's required to absolutely sort of knead into those types of experiences, but like really be gentle with them so that you get a gradual sort of understanding and deconditioning of that response. So you feel a little bit of it, but it's still safe. And then you feel a little bit of it, and you're basically adding more experience of that, whatever that stimulus might be. So the reason that I got so excited here is because I think if we go back to just the common example that's often heard is, you know, men aren't in touch with their emotions, right? And there could be a cultural broad stroke, let's not talk about emotions because if we use a contextual sort of event that happened, World War II and that generation in particular, let's not do that because of how sort of difficult it is to really feel through that and how uncomfortable that might be. And it's not actually impeding on what evolution is really pushing, which is, pass on your genes and survive. It's not really affecting it.
It doesn't care about how happy or fulfilled you are.
Yeah, it's really just whether you're sort of up or down, right?
That's right.
And so at that point, it seems as if this is a really quite a good luxurious thing to do as a species. And I say a luxury because we don't really have constant imposition of physiological threat all that much in this day and age. We kind of wiped out our predation, right?
We don't, but I'm suggesting that most people on the planet do. I'm just suggesting that, we here in our little environment here, but there are people right now who are having bombs dropped on them by other members of their own species. And I'd like to suggest that's a fear and ignorance-driven phenomenon. So we have to remember why this stuff works. How does it work? And it's so easy to say, well, the dinosaurs are gone, so we don't have any real reason to be afraid. The hell we don't.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And again, one that's from a place of privilege because, I didn't choose the circumstances of my birth. And
nor did I.
To not have to really be concerned about bombs falling on my house is it's a pretty damn lucky thing to be able to say.
Yeah.
So to the point of, I think, understanding our emotions on a more granular level and then being able to pick up on this anticipatory fear, which can manifest itself as anxiety, is actually a very worthy cause because you can then manage and reduce the way that you feel negatively around people and especially within yourself through doing the hard work of actually questioning whether this is, to use your terminology, healthy or unhealthy, whether this is pathological for my life or whether it's just like not really that worthy of sort of my time.
Good
because
for you.
A lot of the time it's like these are really mismatched. But I think the difficulty for me here is that so many of my negative states are, yes, fear is, if I just do a root cause analysis, fear is there, but I don't feel scared, right? If I'm angry or frustrated or tense or indignant, I don't feel scared, but I know that fear is there to a degree. And so I think my question here is that how can someone surface these patterns? And if you just have this sort of broad stroke answer, it's like, oh, it's fear, it's like that in itself isn't all that helpful. What would you advise somebody do to really understanding their subconscious fears and then working with them to get to a place where they're no longer sort of steering them in a bad direction?
It's a beautiful question, and there's so much embedded in the question that I've got to kind of break it down. But the simple answer to your question is, in stillness, what we're doing, and again, let me be very clear, stillness isn't a series of techniques, though we use techniques to arrive. Stillness is a state of awareness with no perception of past, not even a split second ago, and no perception of future, not even a split second from now. I'd like to suggest that for the sake of our discussion, I'll say almost, none of our negative emotions exist in an environment other than the past or the future. They are either a regretful reflection on something that's already happened, or worse, an avoidant reaction to something that's already happened. Talk about a futile gesture. Or the anticipation of something, usually negative, or clinically they go so far as to say a catastrophized future. Okay? When you come back to this state of stillness, there is peace, there's quiet, first and foremost. And what we like to do with our stillness techniques, begin with breath, but very special kind of breath, that takes the physical tension, the muscular tension that is what we're feeling when we're feeling fear. One kind or another, muscular tension in the body. We can talk more about that because there's different kinds. We decouple that tension from these representations in our mind, thoughts, memories, and the emotions calm down in that state. And it requires discipline, practice, because we keep wanting to spool these things up with our thoughts. You quiet this down. The body relaxes. The emotions become calm. The mind becomes still and clear. At that point, you're no longer on drugs. Because I'd like to suggest, based on our discussion about these stress hormones, when you're afraid, you're on drugs. And we've seen what those drugs are designed to do. They literally will shut down a big chunk of this frontal cortex because it just takes too much time and energy. So knowing that, quieting that down, enables you to get a much clearer picture. The scope of context expands. And you can begin to realize this anger, this indignation, is actually a secondary emotion that's covering up the underlying fear. This anger gives you a feeling of power. And this righteous indignation gives you the pleasure of feeling, instead of being weak and paralyzed, you're strong and you're right. That can be very useful up to a point, but when it becomes delusional, it gets in your way. How do you know? Get so quiet that you can perceive it. I'm actually afraid right now. What am I afraid of? And it comes up. And you'll realize that your system is offering you an opportunity to perceive it. I've worked with clients, and in the throes of talking about this, I'll throw them a curve that they're not prepared for. I'll say, how old are you right now? And I don't give them an opportunity to think, what are you talking about? They'll say 6. How do you think they knew that? At a very deep, unconscious level, they've gone back, they've regressed, and that is how they're operating, because this traumatic experience has come up, and they're having the same response because it works. The question is, do you want to keep having that same response? Is it beginning to interfere with your life? I know so many people who think they have anger issues. The fact is they have fear issues. And every client I ever had who had anger issues was able to abate those anger issues by going to the underlying fear through stillness and peace. And they replaced that fear with love. They did it. I didn't. I'm just pointing at the thing. It's not me at all. Does that make sense?
It does, but I don't know if I believe it is that easy.
I didn't say it was easy. It's goddamn hard. It's one of the hardest things you will ever do because nothing in you wants to do it. And you're going to listen to that again and again and again. It's not until you don't have a choice. This is screwing my life up. Will you make that shift? Because your limbic system is saying, if you give this up, you're going to die. How easy do you think that's going to be?
Well, let's do it right now.
Okay.
Cool. So it triggered me when you cut me off earlier. And if you'd said, how old are you? I would have said, I'm 13 years old.
Good.
And I have no idea. I'm like
God,
going
I love
into
you.
these. I'm going into these memories. I have no idea where that is.
Good.
I know that this is something that is symptomatic in terms of when people cut me off, it really pisses me off. And this can be like at the grocery store kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I can get more and more tolerant of it. But even this whole conversation, I've been getting still being like, it's not really going to help the podcast if you're pissed off, Henry. You know, it really isn't. So like, keep getting quiet, and understand this. And so when you said, yes, you can just replace it with a state of love, it's like, I know it's there. And I know that if I do the root cause analysis, it probably comes down to perception of status, right? Because that's something that's always been sort of, when I do a root cause analysis, it's other people's opinions of me is like, I mean, this goes back to I think it was our identity podcast, where it's like, it's so, when I do the root cause analysis, it's always there. It's like, that's the thing that is the cause of my suffering. And like, that is linked to the perception of that loss of status. The perception of that loss of status is linked to my psychological survival. So it's like, I get why there's that fear there, but I can't just let go of that, because even as we're talking, I'm finding it very difficult to like get into a state of mind and being where I'm feeling light. You know, I can act, but like I'm not truly feeling that. And this has been something that like, it's pissed me off consciously for 7.5 years and unconsciously for a lot longer. So how do we do that? Because I want to be free of it, and I'm free of it in certain contexts, because it really, now it depends on the person. For somebody that I'm closer to, like you or my parents, it really bugs me. But like if it's more of a stranger, whereas before, if it was like, I'm guessing, what I'm saying is that like the stimulus has to be more salient in terms of the proximal nature of the person to me, in order for it to sort of trigger the response. I don't know. And so I would like to just hear your thoughts on it, because I think that this is, you're right, it's extremely unpleasant. It's extremely uncomfortable for me to even surface this. And I am just, I'm grateful that you've given me the space to do so. But let's do the open heart therapy right now with a case that isn't, 1950s boomers that are, frightened of the war. It's like, no, let's go into it in terms of like, how would you help me as your patient in this situation? And I know that it's particularly difficult because I'm pointing a finger at you. And so I hope that doesn't sort of throw off your emotional state at all in any way, or
it's helpful.
Or is, I don't know. Again, the reason why it's so uncomfortable to bring it up is because I don't want your perception of me to be deflated in any sense. So there's a lot there, but let's use that as a kicking off point, I guess.
Good. Can you feel the shift in your state from when you began talking, this time, uninterrupted, and now?
Yes.
Why? What do you think happened?
I was instead of repressing it, I brought it up and actually put it on, in terms of like, I think of these things like a helmet to wear,
okay.
And it wasn't as scary. The stimulus wasn't as, when actually leaning into it instead of avoiding it, it became, it's sort of like when you've got some type of pain and you really feel the pain, instead of ignoring it, the pain sort of starts to become an amorphous stimulus. I don't know, maybe I was just able to vent it. Again, this is something where it's like I'm surfacing something from my unconscious, so it's hard for me to really understand it. And I hope that you, being a third party and also a domain expert, you can sort of help me to pincer it.
But you're doing that right now. First of all, you're not on drugs. At least the drugs have abated. They've literally leached out of your system to the point where they're not making you crazy. So step one, you did all by yourself. You gave me the all-important feedback, even if you're saying things that I think are just like, whoa, going off the track. Don't interrupt me. So I didn't. That's important feedback. That's more important than, look, what you're saying may or may not be helpful. That's the key. It's being in a situation where you can trust and be trusted. So, no, you're giving me very important feedback as we do what we do. So, we got still together because there was no place for you to spool up because I went down to 0. I'm not busy thinking, oh, I'm mad at Henry for something. No, I just got so still that it expands all the way out, and I love you more, if that's possible, than I would if I've got these chemicals in my brain. Because I'm just an idiot without this stillness thing. So I get quiet. You feed off of that, start to get quiet. Yes, you're venting, but also you're coming back to who you really are when you're not on drugs. That trigger is a gift. When you get triggered, okay, that's when I'm going to ask you, what age were you? You said?
13.
13. Tell me about that. Because nobody is born pissed off. What is happening? Because you said as it gets more and more primal, more and more toward somebody close to me, keep going. You're doing all the work.
In terms of what was happening when I was 13?
Who is interrupting you constantly?
I don't know. I can't, I would have to sit with it and maybe some memory would surface, but like, that's where the reflexive age came out. But like, I can't think of a memory or an experience where something would have really like created that. There isn't, and maybe I've just stuffed it so deeply within myself that like I'm not ready to access it yet.
That may be the truth. That may be the truth. But if you allow yourself, just allow your awareness to just float up above us right now. Don't ask how, don't ask why. Just clear up above where we are. Okay? And I want to ask you, if there was an event in your life, the remembering of which would allow you to let go of this negative emotion associated with having somebody cut you off, at least make it so that you could live with it. Okay? Would that be in your past? Would that be before, during, or after your birth? Let your subconscious mind answer that question.
After.
After, good. What year? Don't think about it. This is your subconscious talking. First time it happened.
What year?
First time it happened. It doesn't have to make any sense to you. 13 didn't make any sense to you. That's good enough. Stay with me now. Get up there high. I want you to go back to that event that you can't remember. Float up above it, though. You're not in it. You can't feel any of that stuff. Just float over that event now. Just do it. Don't think about it. Okay? You got that event underneath you now? Mm-hmm. Good. Now, I want you to just drop down into that event. Okay? Tell me what you feel. Tell me what you see. What's it like? Stay right here with me.
I feel blocked in the sense where it's frustrating because I'm misunderstood.
Yeah.
And I'm not allowed to get that through.
Good.
And it's frustrating.
Good.
It's hot and uncomfortable.
Beautiful. Stay right with me now. Float back up above that experience. You're clear out of it now. You're way above it, looking down on it. Okay? Now I want you to go back even farther, okay, to a time before that event, before even any of the events that led up to that event. Just go there. Okay? And sort of turn around so that you can see that event. It's way out there in the future someplace, but it's out there in the future. It's not where you are now. Okay? You done that? Good. Now, tell me, can you feel that emotion of frustration, that feeling of heat, that feeling of being blocked, or is it gone now?
Gone.
Good. That means we found the event. Even though you don't have any particulars, thank you to your subconscious mind, I want you to float back over that event now. Don't ask how or why. You're doing beautifully. Okay? Now, tell me, what do you know now that that younger version of yourself didn't know about that situation that allows you to let go of that feeling of frustration, that sensation of heat, that feeling of not being listened to? What do you know now that that younger version didn't know, couldn't have known? He was young.
It's all okay.
Can you feel that? Don't make it an intellectual thing. What do you know now?
It doesn't need to be like that.
Yeah. Is this even about you?
It's about him.
Yes. Him. Note that. Now, I want you to take that knowing, okay? And I want you to drop back down into that event with that knowledge that you couldn't have had back then, but now you do. Okay? Take all of that knowledge. It's about him. It's not about you. It doesn't have to be like this. It's fine. Everything's going to be fine. And tell me, do you still have that feeling of frustration, that sensation of heat, that sense that you're not being listened to, or are those feelings and emotions gone now?
There's a much deeper sense of compassion.
Yes.
It's just, there's understanding.
Yes. Love by any other name, which is what you are. And I want to thank you for that. Now I want you to go up above that event again. Stay right here with me. Don't go anywhere. And I want you to look down on that younger version of yourself with the same compassion, because he has spent all of this time suffering. I want you to fill your heart with love. I want you to imagine a source of love above you right now that's infinite, because it's right there. I want you to let it fill you with that love right now to overflowing. Fill your heart, fill your mind. There's nothing left. It's overflowing. And let that overflow go right down to that younger version of yourself. Fill him. Fill him with that. Let him feel that. And anything that's left over, let it overflow to whomever it was. It was a him. Because he needs it too. And you have enough to go around because it's not limited to you. And when you're all finished, come on up. Come on up above that event. And I want you to look down and I want you to let that younger version of yourself know you are the perfect guide. You are the perfect ally. You are the future him. You're living proof that everything is going to be okay. Let him know you will always be there. No matter what. And as you slowly begin to come back now to the present moment, notice that your future self has reached back to help you now. Come all the way back to the present moment, but as you do, stop at any point along the way where that old emotion of frustration, that old feeling of heat, that old sense that you weren't being listened to used to get in your way, and instead replace it with these powerful learnings. It is going to be okay. It doesn't have to be this way. It isn't even about you, it's about him, and that's over. Come on back, but take your time. When you get back to the present moment, you let me know.
Okay.
Okay. Now, just to be sure, I want you to go out into the future because you're getting good at traveling in this illusion of time. Go out in the future to any potential event in the future where that old emotion, that old frustration, that old heat, that old I'm not being listened to would have come up. Okay? Do you find that you can still feel that emotion, or do you feel that it's gone now?
I can still feel it, but it's not as sticky.
Good. Is it going to serve you to still be able to feel it a little?
Yes.
Good. Then please do. Come on back to the present moment now with a little bit more awareness of what it is to expand the scope of your sense of self. What it's like to have a benevolent, loving universe allow you to see past the limits of an ego and to work a minor miracle. Because love has replaced fear today. It wasn't easy, but you did the work. And I want to thank you.
I don't know why you're thanking me.
Because you gave me the opportunity to remember why I'm here. to just serve as a conduit for that, just as you did to that earlier version of yourself. Because eventually, we're all deeply connected the same way you are to that earlier version of yourself. That's why we're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, as you begin to integrate that, it'll take time. Let it. May take days, may take weeks. But that subconscious mind has just released something because it thinks you can handle it. And you can. You did. You leaned into your fear and you conquered it. It became a lesson, a way to become free. I have nothing more to say about that, but namaste. The God in me recognizes the God in you. Period. That's not just a word. So thank you. And come on back, and we'll see if we can resume what we're doing here. But believe me, this is more important than anything we're doing. This is why I love you.
Thank you, Jim.
It's my pleasure. You're thanking the universe. I do every morning and every night. Okay?
That was pretty wild, Jim. Thank you for taking me there, and thank you for also going there with some degree of discomfort, because as much as I like to think that you're not human, it probably doesn't feel good, especially with a couple of cameras on, to be like, you did something wrong. You know, that probably doesn't feel good at all, but you sat with whatever that might have triggered. I'm only just superimposing my reality onto yours. It might not be that at all. But thank you for holding that simultaneously while seeing a window to actually share love rather than express a reciprocal amount of fear in whatever state
Well put.
could have been provoked there.
Well put. Well, again, thank you, because that takes courage. It takes courage to be that open with a couple of cameras on you. And you did. You stayed right here. But we've done a lot of work together, and you've learned that ultimately this is completely safe. Even though your own limbic system may be saying it's not, something deeper than that limbic system spoke. That's what I tap into. I try to tap into that in myself, try to tap into that with other people, but I'm a human being. I'm as flawed as they come.
Yeah, and I think that what has really helped is having a whole heap of experiences with you where getting closer and closer to speaking the truth as it arises within me, instead of trying to manipulate it into something different to what it is, or just ignoring it completely, but being able to address that truth within myself and express it and not have and be met with love. That, I think, is one of the most beautiful gifts that can be given to somebody, because then it is encouraging and there becomes a source of excitement around, oh, holy shit, I've just found something that I'm afraid of, or I found something that I can express in a way that will be able to disarm it in the future.
Good.
If done in the right way. So I thank you for all of those experiences that led us up to this, because it's helping to set me free.
Well, you're not the same person you were when we started this podcast. That's just, in my view, miraculous. I just look in wonder at that. I literally look in wonder at that. And again, if love is the opposite of fear, not hate, okay? Love is the opposite of fear. What do you think happens when you throw love into fear?
One's got to win, and I know which one I'm putting my chips on.
I'd suggest it just neutralizes it. It isn't even a battle. You've got a particle and an antiparticle. Remember from physics? What happens when you throw them together? They just annihilate one another and go back into what's there. Infinite conscious bliss. That's all we're doing here. And you're allowing that to happen by being willing to do what you just did. You leaned into that fear and let that fear teach both of us. You're not the only one that got to learn. What do you think I got to learn? He asks, not cutting Henry off.
Yeah, well, I think that contextually, I hope it isn't not to just like not cut me off kind of thing, you know, because I think there are times when it's like, that's how conversation should work, right? It isn't just sort of like talk about too broad stroke a rule, you know, there could be a point where it's like, yeah, you know, not then, not, or sort of like actually the dance should continue at that point. Because otherwise, if you just have monologue followed by stop, your turn to talk, monologue followed by stop, it doesn't feel very human, if that makes sense. But I think what you learned, hopefully, is that, again, progressively I'm more willing to go to these places, and that for you to express the way that you did in terms of, you know, taking me there, going to the wherever, it's like that's okay, and we can continue to grow, and hopefully that's reinforcing a pattern and a trajectory. Hopefully that's something that you've learned. I think that a lot of these things take time. I know for me there's going to be a lot of reflection in terms of just on that moment and on the stimulus to really try and juice the lemon in terms of, is there more? Mm-hmm. Because there's a point that you made earlier where it's the conscious mind, being the beautiful storyteller that it is, will tell a story that might not necessarily be the right fit for the situation. And I find that questioning that story is learning. You know, is this the right association? Is this the right justification? Is this the right thing? That is, I think, ample ground that I think that for me at least takes time. So if I were to try and oversimplify, I would say, oh, don't cut Henry off. But I don't think that you're that sort of crude. I think that there would be more sort of situational, contextual, and there's a sensitivity that might be sort of amplified. However, I think that there's a sort of contextual aspect that will happen as well, I hope, at least, because, you know, otherwise we might not be having very good conversation. It would just be me kind of rambling too much. Cue to cut me off.
No, it can only get better by doing what we did. But now I get a sensitivity to that, which, you know, we chose to leave some of that in there because, frankly, it's rude to cut somebody off. It's a values judgment made in a split second, but what the hell criterion do I know? So that's how you learn. You learn through association. So this constant learning process, never going to end. So every interaction is an opportunity for me to learn. I'm hoping you do the same thing, but that's why I thank you. It genuinely is an opportunity to learn, to grow.
And to relate to each other,
Mm-hmm.
because at the end of the day, we're very different people
Very,
having a absolutely different experience.
very.
And getting this data from somebody else, I think, is incredibly helpful, especially when it comes to it's not a conflict.
Yeah.
It's a disagreement, and it's but it's not. There's no, the heat, as you mentioned before, cooled off very quickly because of the environment and the state that was sort of reinforced. I mean, your reflex was to tank into stillness, right? And that's such a beautiful thing, because in this particular instance, especially from somebody that doesn't feel as if they're being heard, it's like, poof, here's the floor. Here's that space. Here's what you need.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it starts to quell. And so, again, I think that's a beautiful conditioning that you've put yourself into, because dropping into stillness when something comes to be threatening is something that you have to train yourself to do.
That's right.
And that is a real discipline. And so thank you for that. And I think it leads me quite elegantly to a question of, is there anything that scares you disproportionately than it should? Because I think there's some things that scare everybody. I mean, like, if I put a gun to your head, as we were talking about in death,
Sure,
you're
sure.
gonna get those stress
Sure. Oh, sure.
neurochemicals flooding your
Sure.
system quickly.
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is that depends on the scope of context from which I'm operating at any given time. So at the most micro, the most constricted scope of context, where the juice is, where the drama is, where the conflict is, where the problems are, okay? If I am operating at that level, that scope of context, there are lots of things I'm afraid of. And I mean that, lots of things. As you've seen, I'm lucky enough to have the ability to then navigate to a larger, more expanded scope of context, because that's our skill. Not to pick one place and stay there, it's the ability to navigate. You navigate and expand your scope of context, you're moving toward a broader scope, more wholeness, more completeness, more perspective, and peace. Till finally you get up to the most expanded state, as close to infinitely expanded as you can be. At that space, there's only peace, there's only wholeness. I'm not afraid of anything when my awareness, myself, expands to that point. But I have to be very clear, because that's really a misnomer. There's no me left that's separate to be afraid. So that's what that is. And if that doesn't make any sense right now, well, okay, it will, as soon as that scope of context just becomes part of your regular lexicon. So navigating these scopes of context based on what's happening is the skill that is what we're calling practical spirituality. It's got to work in our daily life. So you saw how it just worked because, okay, now I'm here. How can I be angry at you? In a weird sense, I am you. I'm feeling my own sense of frustration right now at being cut off. Down here, yeah, maybe I'm ready to walk off the the podcast. but it's automatic. If we can have people get that this is a skill they can develop, that eventually you can navigate right up out of the sense of fear that's associated with physical pain. We do work with pain. And I'm suggesting that the fear that's associated with physical pain can be as much as 70 to 75% of your experience of that pain. And if you can decouple that experience of fear about this pain, you're left with a quarter of the pain. That's very manageable. It may not be pleasant, but it certainly is manageable. So at about the mid-level, to answer your question, that is kind of halfway between those two extremes. Remember, one or the other isn't better. We're navigating between them. At this mid-level, I have a genuine concern. I don't know if I would call it a fear, but I have a real concern, a worry, and for the sake of your question, I'll call it fear. I'm afraid of the behavioral result of people who are acting motivated by fear and ignorance. I don't have a fear of them. I have a fear of the behavioral result of them acting out of ignorance and fear, because I have acted out of ignorance and fear. And thank everything that's holy. Thank God that I didn't do anything that I would regret so much that I'd be tortured by it. But I'm suggesting that it's ignorance and fear that produces all these terrible behaviors at an individual level, at a social, cultural level, and at a political level. Acting out of ignorance of these larger scopes of context, and then the resultant fear. And part of the reason that I'm, call it concerned, is that for the first time in our species history, we've evolved a culture that has created industries, whole industries, that are actively nurturing and developing fear and ignorance for profit, because fear and ignorance sell. So if anything, as I do this, that's the one that kind of remains. That's where I'm spending most of my time and effort. And I'm so woefully inadequate to stop it, but I can do the best I can with each individual, with each group, with each opportunity to try and open that up a little bit. I've never met anyone who doesn't change when that scope of context expands.
Yeah, and I think that to build off of that, the reason why so many, these industries, especially technology, has been able to profit off of fear. Mm-hmm. And actually, media has been able to do that for centuries.
Yep.
But in a more recent age, I think it's been absolutely amplified because of the ability to, it's more so there's more profit to be had with more attention that has been put onto whatever platform is trying to take your attention. It's all digital these days. So you're playing around with very high leverage points in the sense of exposure and speed, right? It took a while to pass out a newspaper every day, but it's instantaneous, being able to press a button and then it's anywhere for anybody to see. And I think there you mentioned in our podcast on distraction, it's don't just have more cognizance on what's taking your attention
Yeah.
and question whether it deserves your attention.
Yeah.
And so much of the information that's being spread so quickly is just a need, that a desire that somebody's trying to fulfill, of like, I need more people to be engaged
Yes.
in my platform, whatever it may be. So here's a shortcut to getting it. And it takes a lot of the, it really has undermined the pride that used to be in things like journalism. You know, people used to have a lot more pride in telling the truth. However, now it's become such a quick game of let's try and get as many eyeballs as possible, because that can then be sold to advertisers very quickly. And I can then, you know, go home to a 12-bedroom house instead of a 4-bedroom house type thing. And so I see why that's there, and I see why fear is such a good answer, because if I can truncate a bunch of mini stories that basically throw your emotions all over the place, it's very addictive, right? Because your mind it doesn't want to ignore the stimulus that could potentially be threatening to it. It's just whether that stimulus is actually real, whether that stimulus is actually, and real is a difficult term to use because that's subjective a lot of the time, but like whether that actually has evidence and information behind it that can support whatever claim that may be. So again, I'm waffling here, but it seems as if what you're afraid of is the dissemination of fear at scale and the effects that that's then having on people that you care and love about, people that you care for and love, in particular your clients, who then come to you sort of flustered and afraid. And is it becoming worse? Have you seen it get worse in the past decade?
Well, in a word, yes, it's changing. And what's changing is more and more people are just having an ambient sense of fear and anxiety. And I'd like to suggest that this unconscious fear that just becomes an ambient sort of normal, new normal, recalibrated, gets back to, and forgive me for this, but we begin our work with values. And values operate at an unconscious level for the most part. Values are anything that we're perceiving to be important enough to spend your time, your energy, your money, your resources, your life to have. And your values are driving your behavior. I'd like to suggest that those values, being in a hierarchy of greater to lesser importance, if you value something excessively, I'm not talking about do you value it or not. If you value something excessively, you'll begin to find a fear of losing it because you're increasing your attachment to it. And I don't mean to get all Buddhist on this, but being attached to things, and things don't have to be a physical object on the table, but being attached isn't the same as love. It isn't the same as loving something or loving someone. Love has a tendency to set things and people free, allow to be. Attachment clings. It hangs on to. It's an egoic thing. Me. I want this. I need this. I'm afraid of losing it. I'm going to protect. I'm going to get angry if somebody wants me. I'm going to get jealous if somebody... And all these negatively valenced emotions start erupting. So if we can get to the point where we can get quiet enough to get down to what is it we really love and why. Just that simple exercise, who are you and what do you love, can result in a profound simplification of your life to where you have what you need and you're living and thriving instead of thrashing and trying to survive. The level of fear drops the fewer things you're afraid of. And it's this behavior that I'm afraid of that's the result of ignorance of these deeper principles. Ignorance of the capacity to feel what it is you're trying to feel by getting more stuff or saying bad things to somebody else to put them, whatever it is. And realizing that the level of fear just drops away. And then the only thing that's left is people cooperating with one another. I've seen it. I've seen it with couples. I've seen it with groups. Groups of people that suddenly go from being hostile to being really compassionate. And that's so powerful. Sometimes in my wildest states, I think that's the point. To feel the privation of those higher states so you can appreciate it when you get back to them. That's a weird sense that I have about how this thing works. Don't know what you've got till it's gone, and you don't know how to appreciate something unless you haven't had it. So I hope that kind of gets around the corner on what that is about.
Yeah, and I think that it really helps to be able to drop the story. Because I think that, again, we derive so much of these emotions from the truncated mini stories that we're telling ourselves about certain situations. And I mean, again, to go back to our sort of deep dive into my triggers, it's like the first thing that you did was drop the stories within yourself so that you didn't basically continue to spool up one that would put you into a state that wasn't helpful for the situation.
Right.
And you're talking about people that have a tremendous amount of power in the sense where their decisions are at leverage points that have cascading effects. And so having an ability to stop that story and be able to transcend whatever sort of conflict might be occurring to then expand the scope of context and really open up the tribal nature that is really occurring, and to like see something for, instead of this being a conflict, to see it as a problem to solve. I think that it's a beautiful skill that I really hope that people start to respect the utility for based on these conversations, because you know, it's like you saw it in action, right? And I think that this type of work, this type of training can only be beneficial for people, and it's only helped our species in the past. You know, you start looking at the literature, and a lot of people have been here before. This isn't new territory.
That's the point.
It isn't something that's special by any means. It's incredibly special, especially the experience. But I don't think the information's new at all.
No.
I think that something that, again, is really heavily intertwined here is when the story that you're telling yourself becomes threatened, when your ego becomes threatened. For example, the threat that I was experiencing earlier was maybe this image, this self-image that I tell myself I am is at risk from not being able to express himself in a way that he feels is just to the feeling inside. Now, that is something that is a fool's errand, because I will never be able to talk my way to the feeling I have within myself and these like little sort of attributes that I'm so excited about as my story. Yeah. So that is what I fully identify with. Now, when that identity is mismatched, I think that that's where I go into or people in general, but that's where a lot of triggering occurs. For example, if I were to say, you know, Jim is a complete charlatan and he's never had the experience of stillness, if this were especially in a more public setting and we didn't have the relationship and people didn't have the context, it could be like, I'm actually screw you, because I have all of this evidence that's backing up this story that I'm telling myself about myself here. So again, a very waffly question that you probably should cut short because it's taken us off the tracks. But if it's, I think it might be important here. How much of fear is really laced in ego and laced in identity itself? And is that something that, again, is it as simple as stopping the story within yourself and expanding beyond ego? Is it that simple to be able to help nurture and quell those situations?
Well, first, simple isn't easy. Don't be fooled. It's one of the hardest things. Remember, simplicity is the elimination of the unessential. That means letting go of a lot of stuff. And if your primary value is, I need to make my mark in the world, okay, well, I don't mean to be cute here, but who's the arbiter of whether or not you've made your mark? You just threw your center to somebody else. So if you were to say, and let's just use your expression, in public, okay, Jim's a total charlatan. Okay, what does that mean? When you say Jim's a charlatan, what does that mean?
That you're a fraud, in another word.
Okay, what does a fraud mean?
That you're saying something that you don't have the ability to be able to do in this instance.
Good. Well, clearly, anything I'm saying I'm doing, that's available to anybody. So I'm not telling myself a story here. I'm just living a certain way. And so if somebody says Jim's a charlatan, okay, that's their view. I can go into it and say, I wonder what I've done to give that person that impression. But here's the key. And this is where the story part kind of takes on a different flavor, quality. If there's truth in that, and I know it, if I'm telling a story so that other people will think something of me, that's going to go right to my core. I'm going to get angry. I'm going to do all kinds of things built on the fear that somebody's going to discover that I'm in fact a fraud. But if I'm not a fraud, if what I've been saying the entire time is, I'm next to nothing. There's so little me here. And I'm actually actively working at eliminating more and more of this story because I'm just perceiving that the story is the problem. Well, then if somebody says you're a fraud, in that context, I don't even know what that means. It doesn't trigger me all that much. If somebody says, well, that's going to affect how many people watch the podcast, well, then don't watch the podcast. All I'm doing is just trying to point to something that has really helped me. I'm not trying to sell it. It's helped me hugely. I think it can help other people. If it doesn't, don't do it. But if I were trying to hustle this thing, if increasingly it's about me, look at me, I'm the guy who knows. I don't know anything. The entire time we just did the work that we were doing, I'm telling you, it's not me. I'm like a pipe. I'm Yo-Yo Ma's cello. You don't think it's cello for Bach. He's playing that thing. All I'm doing is trying to get out of the way, because everything I've done as an individual, egoically driven, has been a mess. It really has. If it hadn't taught me so much, I would feel really bad about a lot of it. But so I may have a slightly different response to it. And don't forget, I'm at a different stage in my life. I spent a lot of time in different careers building a reputation. I spent a lot of time making sure that I got credit in the film business, because that's how you earn a living. I didn't want to be doing that, but that's how you make a living. First question somebody asks you is, well, what have you done before? I'd love to be able to say, I'm just here, I'm just being me, but nobody will hire you. So I understand all of this stuff. What I'm saying is, as you begin to include this feeling of being so much more than this narrative, this fear-based thing, I can't do what I'm supposed to do, but I have to do it or else I'm nobody in this world. So understand that part of what I'm trying to do is give you tools that come in geezerhood. And it just may not be the right time yet. I just would love it if you didn't have to wait to be a geezer before you got some of those tools, because they've really helped me.
Do you mind if I try and think about, if I try and express what I think went through your head when I asked you that question?
Sure.
So I'm asking you a question where basically I say, okay, Jim, how much of fear is tied up with identity? And then I use the example of something in terms of, you being publicly told that you're a charlatan. And that is something that I've seen spiritual leaders happen to them publicly, and it's one of the hallmarks that I use is somebody actually having that experience? Because when they then get triggered, it's, to your point, it's like there's something there they're telling somebody something, but there could actually be a fear, because it's like, well, actually, am I that or am I not?
Exactly.
And so I think that there's two components to this. Mm-hmm. And one of them is me putting on my own fear that you then sort of very gently sort of presented in a way where it's like, yeah, if you value trying to make your mark in the world, and here it was in a palatable enough sense where then I can reflect on this in the future and be like, shit, is that an unconscious value of mine in terms of, if I don't have that, could that be something that is the cause of a lot of my suffering, and actually something that's driving my behavior is make a mark in the world, mm-hmm. And potentially something that's driving my fear. So in that question, the way that I framed it, I would only imagine that the first thing that you thought was okay, he's framed this question in a way of something that he's afraid of. Okay. So let's kind of present a part of the answer in a way that's gentler and more palatable for him to then be able to digest and reflect upon, because understanding his own fears and his own values can help set him free.
Yeah.
Was that part of the thought process, or is that just me superimposing a story about how everything is actually about me, onto the way that you were sort of thinking about it? All right,
in fairness, it's a little of both. First, I'm suggesting that whole thought process is a post hoc narrative itself.
Yes.
What happened was I was still in the moment, and what happened. I wasn't separate from it, analyzing anything. And if that doesn't make sense, let's talk about that. But that's literally what happens. And it's the only time I trust what happens. Because when I sense, and I can sense it like that I've popped up in my head, I shut the F up and get still because I'm going down a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down. It may be okay, but chances are it won't. When I do that, that doesn't mean I don't prepare for things. I prepare for this podcast, but I'm not thinking, okay, this is where this has to go and this is where it's just happening. We're here. So, in a sense, part of the deconstruction of that narrative is to understand your narrative about the narrative is a narrative. And it just goes on and on and on because this mind is not going to stop doing what it's doing. Don't fight it. Let it wind itself down, though. All it's trying to do is keep you safe. Let it know that you're safe. You had a state shift where suddenly you knew everything was okay. That wasn't a rational thought. You were utterly irrational. Thank you very much for your willingness. What do you know now that you didn't know when you were that younger version of yourself? It's okay. Well, I'm begging you, know that more and more and more. Get that context. Because people who know it's okay don't respond out of ignorance and fear. Now, if they don't understand and they're just going la, 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 everything's going to be okay, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not a deep sense of it's going to be okay. That comes from work. And you're earning that right now. You're not just playing Pollyanna and, saying, oh, I'm just going to ignore things. Ignorance comes from the word ignore. You're not ignoring it. You're diving right in the middle of it. And from that, you're arriving at this conclusion. Might be fleeting at first. It's okay. I'd like to suggest that's the only reason anyone does anything, including trying to make a mark for themselves, to feel that it's going to be okay. It already is. That doesn't mean don't make a mark. Just don't make a mark out of fear. We talk about away from motivation, fear-based motivation. I'm doing what I'm doing because I'm afraid of something and I'm trying to avoid it. Powerful motivation, and it works, but it only works for a while until the caustic nature of that fear begins to cost more than the benefit of its motivation. I'm suggesting if you can transition then, still highly motivated, to a motivation of love of what you're doing, the love of what you're doing is pulling you toward it. You will make a mark because you are doing what you love and you're doing it more and more. You're getting better and better at it. And you're going to realize, I never realized. This is just delightful and surprising ways. I am now making a mark, but I'm doing it over here instead of in this formalized thing that I thought I had to do because that's what I thought people wanted. Any new industry isn't from the rearview mirror. It's something brand new because somebody's in love with whatever it is. And so as you begin to realize fear, love, the quality of my life can get better and better and better, and I'm still doing the same things. I'm just doing them for vastly different reasons. You're going to make a huge mark. I have no idea what it is specifically you're going to do, but I have no doubt you're going to make a huge mark. But I think part of that mark is going to be helping other people realize what you've had to come to realize. If the only reason I'm trying to make a mark is to win approval from somebody else, I'm at the mercy of other people all the time. I have no center. All I can do is alleviate my fear temporarily That's the best I can hope for. I'm just clawing my way up a cliff. God, I'm not afraid people are going to disrespect me for a minute. Then another challenge comes along, and what if people don't? Oh, you shift into, I'm doing it for the love of it, and frankly, I don't give a flying fig what anybody thinks of it. This is the most amazing thing to be doing. I can't sleep because I can't wait to get back at it. That's where you're going to make a mark. And you're well on your way.
Well, Jim, I think that when it comes to role models in general, the word model is very important because we basically map ourselves. We are always comparing and we map ourselves onto somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I immediately got from not my last question, but the one before, was that when you act in a way that's in accordance to who you are, it creates that sense of authenticity.
Yeah.
Then somebody trying to defame your authenticity kind of just seems silly. It's like, well, of course my shirt's not purple. You know, it's like you can say it's purple, but it's just not. So I think that helped to answer my question in terms of if you're deriving value intrinsically rather than extrinsically, there is a nature of confidence that comes along with that. We discussed all of this in identity. And I think continuing to build on top of that is that you then being a role model of somebody that has pursued something that they love and has got out of it a life well lived instead of one that is in paranoia and in fear and in conflict. It's really helpful for this world, I hope. It's been incredibly helpful for me because if to what you're saying, I am able to make a mark just by saying like, hey, I'm really trying to make a mark here and it's not working the way I want it to in terms of I'm not getting what I want even if I get it. And, you know, it's my center's outside of myself and I don't feel the fullness that I deep down, not even need, deep down am, right? That's so bloody important. So I thank you for living the life that you have lived, but I thank you more for being willing to come out of the shadow and for allowing me to say like, hey, let's put a couple of cameras on you and your mic's hot. Because that as a reflex is like, this guy's got something important to say and this guy's a guy. And that promotes a story that I think is even harder to escape from. And I don't think it's where you want to be living your life at all. I actually believe it to be severely uncomfortable. But I think that discomfort, we were mentioning it just earlier, it's like that discomfort is something that you can grow from. But I don't think it's something necessarily that's you need to continue, you know, with the hazing for too much longer. We've only got 4 of these left afterwards, so I promise I'll not contort you into something that isn't necessarily all that conducive to the person that you want to spend your time actually being.
Well, first, thank you for that, but understand something. This is the closest I could possibly be to wit what we just did in this particular podcast, to working one-on-one with people, which is what I do. That's where the undistracted, undiluted magic is. You start bringing more and more people in, and it becomes less and less personal to them, becomes more and more generalized. There's a lot of generalized stuff that's important, but the reality is this would have no appeal to you if it wasn't personalized to you. And somebody else sitting in the room saying, yeah, but I want to be a rock star, part of you is just going, oh God, do we have to listen to that again? I get what I get out of working with each individual. And that's where the just one-on-one undistracted magic, because then what happens is that induces up to the absolute universal. So I keep doing the same work, but in different ways. And then it comes back down and it's specific to them. So it's not like I'm trying to be a recluse. It's just that's kind of antithetical, this sort of be the man. That's antithetical to what I'm doing. It cannot be about me, or I've failed. Does that even make sense?
Yes, but it didn't for a long time, so I'll reword it in a way that I understand it.
Good.
And if it's off base, please let me know. If it's not on kilter by any means. But the experience that you have in stillness every morning is so expansive and so beyond self being a very key term here. You literally are, you stop all of the story making and you are not Jim. Mm-hmm. You are whatever it is that is underlying everything in this universe. You return to wholeness, completeness, mm-hmm. to oneness, that then to have a separate self that is promoting its separateness by being more and more special is then laughable as you're laughing. It's like, that's just silly. Like, it's so human and it's so understandable.
It's a lead wetsuit. So go for a swim with a lead wetsuit. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So then to have that be a part of the extrinsic identity that is sort of tapped onto you as like the guy who knows is frustrating. However, when working with people one-on-one, you're able to just continuously let go,
yes.
drop, connect,
yes.
drop, connect, and just be there with that person.
Mm-hmm.
And that person then gets the feeling of, oh, this is so specific to me. And therefore it's like, I'm special and lucky and all of this stuff. And like, let's work on my problems in the domains that I'm getting them in. Mm-hmm. It's far easier for you to be authentic, mm-hmm. because to not even the story that you're telling yourself, but the story that you're not telling yourself. Yeah. It's more authentic. It's easier to be authentic to that.
Yeah.
Than all of these other situations where it's like, hey, Jim, here's a stage and a spotlight. It's like, oh, shit. You know, it's like, I'll do it. But it's kind of out of obligation to a couple of kids that asked, hey, you know, it's been so helpful for us to get this. Yeah. Can we see if we can share it with more?
Yeah.
You know, of course that's hard for you to say no to. But little did you know what it would then entail to actually have to deliver upon that, and how many sort of hypocritical situations it could put you in, and just difficult terrain to navigate. I didn't know it when I asked it, but I was a naive 23-year-old when we first got into business. Yeah. It's like, shit, you know, it's asking a lot for somebody who is practicing being nobody.
But here's the beauty of this thing, which I couldn't possibly have predicted. And this is what I'm asking people to just understand, how big and how powerful this thing, this universe, call it whatever you want. I mean, the nomenclature is the problem. And how delightful and surprising the way it works is. In retrospect, okay, post hoc, what better way for me to really refine the thing I'm doing than to put myself in that situation? I would have never done it by free will. And yet something made me say, yeah. Different motivations made me say, yeah. But it wasn't until I got my foot caught in the door because of you guys that I couldn't just say, whoa, this isn't for me, and just leave. I had to go through that thing. What a perfect way for me to really burn out more and more of the stuff that's resistant in me to letting go of everything. But I'll just tell you something. When I say letting go of everything, last night I was having a tough time getting back to sleep. I'd woken up and I needed to get sleep so we could do this thing today. I told my wife, Peggy, this morning. She just laughs at this because she knows this guy's out of his mind. As part of my process of getting back to sleep, because it's very challenging when you're in that what's called a hypnagogic state, you're half asleep, you're half awake, to consciously control things. So I'm in there doing this technique of bringing myself right back to this present moment. And I'm letting go, and I'm letting go, and I'm letting go. I'm feeling myself dropping more and more into this place that has no form, no structure, heart-based, but that's just the portal. You drop in. It gets quieter and quieter and quieter. And you start feeling everything falling away, everything. And I actually had a momentary freeze on it as this tiny little thing in the back of me says, are you in fact making yourself die right now? And if so, are you sure you don't want to let Peggy know before you go? That's this thing that occurred to me. And I said, no, I think it's good. Went ahead, and next thing I know, it's 4:30 in the morning, time to get up. Boom. That's the kind of shit that happens when you're getting that deep into stillness. It's not me doing it, it's doing it. And so going through this process with you guys, I wouldn't get out of that for anything. Do I like every bit? No. But that's the thing. If I like everything, I'm not growing at all. You've helped me grow in ways that I don't know anybody who could have helped me grow like that. So all I can do is thank you guys.
And it seems to have updated a belief where now you're even more enthusiastic about discomfort, where it's like, great, I will lean in harder because of what I know there to be on the other side. And the fruits of the labor are really internal, because being able to burn out and let go more aspects of self mean that there are fewer triggers and associations that can put you into states of mind that are further along the fear spectrum than they are the love spectrum. And if you have more access to the states on the love spectrum, you then have more access to the ones that you were talking about that you were touching in the middle of the night last night, where it's like, wow, I'm just floating around in heart space, and am I dead? No, boom, but it's fine. That's pretty damn cool.
Well, and again, just to make a point and then let it go, that's not me talking. That's what I mean. That state is so expanded beyond this guy. There's a sense of love. I don't want, Peggy to wake up with this cadaver next to her and not have said by one last time, look, you're the most important person in the world to me. I love you. She knows it. And then, poof. But what she said was very, very profound this morning when I told her that. She got a little teary and she said, what a great way to commit suicide. A little light goes on in her head. What a great way to die. Consciously. Go figure. Because you find this in a lot of this literature, but it's like, what the hell are they talking about? Dying consciously. Oh, yeah. Any idiot can do it. Just shut up. That's my point. I'm living proof. This isn't anything special. All you have to do is just keep getting quiet. It will take care of it.
Yeah,
And
because
you know that.
you keep getting quiet. It's like what we did earlier. You undo these trauma knots, and there's less fear that's sort of binding you in your future states.
Yeah.
And the more you undo,
Yeah.
we're talking about this with spirit. It's like you're getting rid of the endarkenment. You know, you're really just sort of massaging your way through this all.
Yeah.
And then it's inevitable. I really do believe it, especially when you start pouring gas on it, because I believe what you have effectively helped me to do, somebody that thinks very heavily in stories, somebody that is very analytical, is you've helped me to set up a system of beliefs where it's like, I mean, we were talking about it earlier and I got really excited because it's like, here's the justification to be more specific with the things that are triggering me and that are categorically misfit to what I believe to be like the best states of mind that I can get into.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you've just given my analytical mind a double bind. You know, it's now like, oh, cool, I've got to get still more. You know, it's now justifying the practice that is helping to really understand these emotions in the first place.
Yeah.
And so I can't thank you enough, because I think that that's been an incredible tool for a Brit that had a very stiff upper lip to loosen the fuck up a little bit. So I think that this is a good way to sort of round off, because we're back where we started with me thanking you.
Well,
So thank you,
I
Jim.
thank you right back. You now are even more clear on why. That isn't just lip service. Speaking of a stiff upper one, I genuinely mean it. This exploration is taking me places that are just delightful and utterly surprising. So thank you. I hope it's helping you. I hope it's not just putting you to sleep, but yeah, I'll leave that up to you.
So as always, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. Now, if you're looking to build a stillness practice yourself, we have a lot of free resources, audios that Jim's recorded, etc., and you can see those in our show notes below. Along with that, there are also online courses that you can roll in if you want to learn more from Jim. We also have obsidian mind maps. You can see a couple of them popping up here on the screen. Now, these are really cool ways to look at the podcast information and really just get an overview of all of the podcast topics and deepen the information within yourself. And within them, there are more of Jim's recordings. There's also a lot of Jim's artwork. So if you're interested in any more still life stuff, you can find a bunch of links in the description below. Finally, I really hope that you're getting as much out of this as I have. This is why we started this whole thing in the first place, because the combination of Jim and the practice of stillness had really helped to transform our lives here at Still Life. We just wanted to make as much of that available to you. So hopefully you're getting a lot out of it, and please let us know if there's anything that you want to see more of in the future, or less of. Anyway, hope you have a lovely day. Bye-bye.